Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Do you know your true worth? Because until a certain night, I thought mine was measured in how much I could bend, how often I could smile through being sidelined, and how quietly I could let things slide without turning them into a scene. Graduation was supposed to be the one evening where I didn't have to share a stage, where years of late-night studying, part-time jobs, and loans piling up would finally feel justified because my family would be there, clapping for me. Instead, I found myself staring at a text from my mother that read, "Sweetheart, we're so proud of you, but Eric's engagement dinner is the same night, and we can only be in one place." You understand, right? I remember rereading it several times, not because the message wasn't clear, but because I could not quite believe that they were saying it so casually, like it was simply logistics and not a choice that cut me down to size. The kicker was that Eric didn't just stumble into this scheduling accident. He knew when my graduation was. He had the invitation. He joked about parking being a nightmare on campus that day. Yet somehow, his dinner was booked at a nice Italian restaurant across town, at the exact same time as the ceremony. When I confronted him on the phone, he chuckled and said, "Come on, Maya, this is an engagement. You graduate every day in life, but people only get engaged once." It was such a ridiculous line that for a second I almost laughed, but then I realized he wasn't joking. He meant it. Noah, my boyfriend, didn't even let me sit in silence for too long. He said, "So let me get this straight. They're all going to eat pasta while you cross the stage with your name being read out." His voice had that edge of dry disbelief, the kind that makes you realize just how wrong something is when you're still trying to excuse it. My Aunt Lila, my dad's sister, was the only family member who didn't buy into Eric's narrative. She showed up with flowers, sat through the long list of names, and clapped so loudly for me that people turned their heads. It was embarrassing in the moment, but later, I would think back to that sound and realize it mattered more than I admitted. My parents, of course, promised to make it up to me. "We'll have a little celebration later, just us," my mom said on voicemail, the tone sugary enough to make it clear she thought this was a fix. I didn't call her back that night. Instead, I went home, opened my phone, and started saving everything. The engagement invite timestamped 3 days after my graduation schedule was posted, the text where Mom told me to be understanding, the group chat where Eric bragged about how many people RSVP'd to his dinner. I didn't know why I was saving them, but something in me whispered that receipts would matter. And then, almost as if the universe had been listening, an email landed in my inbox the very next morning. It was from a probate attorney with the subject line, "Instructions regarding Evelyn and Thomas Carter estate." My grandparents. My heart jumped because I hadn't expected anything formal to come my way. I thought whatever they left would be evenly split, like most families do, and I certainly didn't think I'd be singled out for anything. The attorney asked me to come by the office the following week, saying, "There is a sealed letter addressed to you specifically, to be delivered after your graduation." I sat there staring at the screen, thinking about my grandmother's voice in my head, the one that always told me, "Don't waste your no. Earn it." I hadn't really understood what she meant when she said that growing up. But suddenly, with my parents fawning over Eric's big night while I clutched an empty chair at mine, I started to think maybe she knew this exact moment would come, and maybe she'd prepared something I wasn't supposed to ignore. Noah leaned over my shoulder, read the email, and whistled low. "Well, that sounds like something they won't be happy about," he said. He was half grinning, half serious, and I knew he was already calculating what kind of storm this might bring. I didn't answer him right away because in that moment all I could think about was how strange it felt. My parents had chosen not to see me walk that stage, but my grandparents had timed a letter to arrive right after, like they wanted their applause to land where theirs never would. And that was the first time in my life I felt the tables even beginning to turn. Not because I was planning anything yet, not because I wanted revenge, but because for the first time, I held something they couldn't control, a letter from people they had long underestimated, placed in my hands alone. I didn't tell my parents about the attorney's email. I didn't tell Eric. I simply circled the date on my calendar and waited, all the while wondering what words my grandmother had left me and why they had to be sealed. When I finally walked into that attorney's office, the receptionist handed me an envelope with my name written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I turned it over, realizing this was no ordinary inheritance paperwork. This was something meant only for me, hidden until I reached this exact point in life. And in that moment, sitting with that letter unopened, one thought echoed louder than all the hurt and all the silence of my family's absence. Are you ready for a shocking truth? When I slit the envelope and unfolded my grandmother's letter, expecting some gentle blessing or a sentimental memory that would make me cry and then tuck it into a drawer, what I found instead was a careful, plain-spoken roadmap written in the voice I knew so well, the voice that never wasted words and never confused kindness with indulgence, spelling out that I was the sole heir to their estate with conditions that sounded less like a gift and more like a backbone my grandparents were handing me at last, because they wrote that the inheritance existed to secure my independence and my peace, and that any person who tried to coerce, guilt, or manipulate me regarding these funds would, upon documented proof, disqualify themselves from certain separate bequests they had informally expected, which meant my yes finally had weight and my no finally had consequences. I read the letter twice, then a third time with Noah sitting beside me, and with every pass the language became less abstract and more concrete. Since my grandparents had attached a small ledger that cataloged years of small exchanges I barely remembered and that no one else in the family would have bothered to write down. Like the time I insisted on paying back part of a book stipend because I had gotten a discount, or the many weekends I babysat cousins and refused the extra cash or the note my grandfather scrawled after my clinical rotation where he wrote, "She shows up," and while none of it was about money in a dramatic sense, all of it was about attention and memory and the quiet math of who invests in whom and who only appears when the lights are on. I knew before I even left the attorney's office that I wasn't going to announce this to my parents, not because I wanted to be secretive for its own sake, but because the letter asked me to protect the intent by moving slowly, by keeping records, and by refusing to negotiate my boundaries in the heat of family emotion. So I thanked the attorney, asked a few practical questions about timelines, taxes, and how exactly the coercion clause would be evaluated, and left with a folder that felt heavier than its paper should have allowed, a weight that was equal parts relief and responsibility. By the time I reached my car, the family group chat was buzzing with a new post from my mother, a cheerful collage of old photos of me in cap and gown that were clearly from high school, paired with a caption about our brilliant daughter. That conveniently omitted the part where they had missed the actual ceremony, and while a few relatives commented with heart reactions and exclamation points, I felt the familiar squeeze of being turned into a prop, because the public praise cost nothing and the private choice had cost me everything, which is the sort of accounting my grandparents understood and my parents never did. Eric called within the hour, and he did not even bother with the usual small talk before rolling into what he called aligning celebrations, and then, with the subtlety of a brick through a window, mentioning down payments and escrow like these were romantic topics any sister would be thrilled to discuss the week after her graduation. When I let the silence breathe long enough for him to hear himself, he pivoted into charm. Said he wanted a redo dinner where the family could toast me properly. And then he tossed in the line that told me everything I needed to know, which was that he hoped we could pool resources so no one feels stretched, a phrase that always seems generous until you realize it means you will be the pool. That was the moment the letter stopped being theoretical and turned into procedure, so I sat at my desk and began building a private album I titled, Without Irony, Support I Provided, and into it I dropped screenshots of past transfers. The time I covered a month of my parents' phone bill because my dad's overtime got cut, the groceries I bought when mom asked for a little help until Friday, the rent spot I floated Eric when he was between commissions, the gas money I refused to let my mother pay back after a late-night urgent care visit, and as I compiled it all I felt two things at once. Anger that I had normalized this much quiet giving, and relief that my instincts to keep receipts were finally serving a purpose that was larger than proving a point in an argument I never wanted to have. I shared the album link with exactly two people, Noah and Aunt Lila, and I told them it was a vault, not a weapon. Because my goal wasn't to humiliate anyone, it was to stop the lazy lies that always flourish when no one is willing to put facts in daylight. And both of them promised to keep it locked until and unless we needed it to answer a claim that I was being ungrateful, selfish, or unreasonable, which are the three labels families reach for when the person who has always absorbed the cost finally declines the bill. That evening, my mother texted me a message that read like an invitation, but moved like a directive, explaining that she and my father wanted to host a proper celebration the following weekend, and that she had already spoken to the manager at a restaurant that required a deposit, and while she was still typing, she sent a second photo. A guest list that was not a family gathering at all, because it included Eric's realtor, Brianna's parents, two of my father's golf friends, and someone tagged as Pastor Greg, who has never said my name correctly, which told me the event was not about me, it was about optics, introductions, and the kind of networking that would make Eric's engagement look even larger while my graduation was folded into the decor like a centerpiece you pretend is a gift. I stared at the list and realized my parents believed they could paint over what they had done with a loud room and a microphone, that they could add me as an agenda item and call it honor, and that they were counting on me to absorb the cost with a smile because that is what I have always done, and I felt a calm I had never felt before settle in, not the numb kind that keeps you small, but the steady kind that makes your voice clear and your terms simple. Because while I could not make them choose me on the night that mattered, I could choose what story I allowed them to sell afterward. So I typed back that I would review the details in writing, that any celebration of me would be scheduled by me, paid for equally by those hosting it, and limited to people who had actually shown up for my graduation. And that since I had an attorney appointment related to my grandparents' estate during the same week, my time was not flexible, and I pressed send and set the phone down, fully aware that I had just stepped over a line I had been drawing in pencil for years and finally inked it in permanent marker. The three dots appeared, disappeared, then returned, and when my mother's reply finally landed, it was a long, polished paragraph about family unity, how this was a chance to mend fences, and how she had already reserved extra seats because people were excited, followed by a separate message with the words "final guest list" attached, and as I opened the document and saw the names stack up in neat little rows under a header that said "redo for Maya and engagement pre-party," I felt the letter in my bag like a quiet pulse and understood that the next move would not be theirs. When the so-called final guest list appeared on my phone, formatted like a polished document for a corporate event rather than a family gathering, I understood immediately that this redo celebration had nothing to do with honoring my graduation and everything to do with securing another round of applause for Eric, while using my name as the excuse for an extra headcount. And that realization carried less sting than I would have expected, because by this point I had stopped confusing being mentioned with being valued. My parents called that evening, their voices rehearsed and insistent, explaining that since the deposit for the restaurant had already been made, it would be simplest if I just stepped in and handled the reservation with my card because, as my mother phrased it, the estate will cover you soon enough. I let her finish the speech without interrupting, because I wanted to hear every word, every casual reference to money that had not even cleared probate yet, and every assumption that my role in this family had shifted overnight from ignored daughter to silent financier, and then I asked for something that shocked her into silence, which was a written breakdown of costs, a firm agreement that any expenses would be split evenly among the hosts, and a clear confirmation that the event would be capped at 2 hours so it did not interfere with the meeting scheduled with the attorney. The silence stretched for long enough that I thought the call might have dropped, but then my father cleared his throat and said, with that slow paternal tone that always tried to turn a refusal into a lecture, that families did not nickel and dime each other, that sometimes one person steps up for the good of everyone, and that if I wanted to be taken seriously as part of this family's future, I needed to start thinking less like a student and more like an adult. I almost laughed, not because any of it was funny, but because the irony of being told to grow up by the same people who had chosen fettuccine over their daughter's once-in-a-lifetime ceremony was too rich to ignore. Instead of snapping, I told him calmly that since adulthood was on the table, he should consider this my adult response. I would not front costs, I would not be the pool they dipped into, and if they wanted to celebrate me, they could start by respecting that my time and my resources were not community property. The following morning, My phone buzzed with a new group text that looked more like a financial report than a family conversation. It was a screenshot of a spreadsheet titled Wedding Launch Plan, color-coded and neatly organized, with columns for vendors, deposits, and family contributions. At first glance, I thought it had been sent by mistake, but then I saw my name in bold, next to a 5-figure number, under a line item labeled Maya, Contribution to House and Event. The audacity of it hit me like a cold splash of water. They had not even asked. They had not even hinted in polite terms. They had simply budgeted me into Eric's new life, as if my inheritance was already theirs to spend, as if my grandparents' final wishes were a family slush fund, as if my role was to make sure my brother's wife-to-be could pose for Instagram photos in a house with a marble island. I sat there staring at the screen, and instead of rage, what I felt was clarity. For years, I had been told that family means sacrifice, that helping without question was proof of love, and that questioning the imbalance was selfish, but now I had in front of me something undeniable. Documented evidence that my parents and my brother saw me not as a daughter or a sister, but as a line item, a financial instrument, a convenient solution to their ambitions. I took a screenshot immediately, saved it in the same secure folder as the texts and receipts, and then forwarded it to the attorney with a simple question. Does this qualify as coercion under the clause in my grandparents' letter? The response came faster than I expected, and the words were both validating and sobering. Yes. Document thoroughly. Do not engage in verbal negotiations. Keep all communication in writing. That answer gave me something I had never had in this family before: leverage backed by law. It wasn't just my word against theirs. It wasn't just feelings or memories. It was paper and ink, numbers and names. Undeniable proof that the people who were supposed to protect me were trying to fold me into obligations that my grandparents had explicitly warned against. Noah looked over my shoulder, read the attorney's response, and said, "Then the rules of the game just changed," and he was right, because from that moment on, I stopped speaking to my parents and Eric in real-time conversations and insisted everything be sent by email or text, framing it as convenience, but knowing full well it was also strategy. Predictably, this shift infuriated them. My mother sent long, dramatic texts about how families who put things in writing were families on the verge of collapse. My father left me voicemails warning that I was making everything legal when it should be about love. And Eric shot me a message that was so revealing I saved it 3 different times in 3 different places, because in his frustration he wrote, "Everyone knows the estate solves all this, so stop being difficult." That single sentence, written in his own words, was the crack in their argument so wide you could drive a truck through it, because it proved they weren't celebrating me, they were circling me, waiting for the estate to drop into their laps. And my refusal to bend was the only thing keeping their plans from being complete. In the middle of all this, Aunt Lila called, not to tell me what to do, but to remind me what my grandparents had stood for, which was fairness, accountability, and the belief that respect is proven in actions, not in empty toasts. And she told me quietly that she had heard whispers about Eric bragging to relatives that I was going to cover half the cost of his new house. I thanked her, promised her that things would not unfold the way he expected, and after I hung up, I realized I no longer felt like the overlooked daughter at the graduation ceremony. I felt like the executor of a plan I had not created, but had been entrusted to carry out, and that difference mattered more than I could explain. So when the next email from my mother arrived, with attachments about menus, headcounts, and the importance of making a united front for Eric's future in-laws, I did not respond with anger or apology or compromise. I responded with one short paragraph that spelled everything out in adult terms. I would not host, I would not pay, and I would not participate in any event that blurred my graduation into Eric's engagement. If they wanted a redo, they could do it without me. If they wanted my presence, they would have to accept my terms. And if they wanted my money, they could stop wanting, because that door was closed. What happened next was exactly what I expected, and exactly what I needed. My father's fury, my mother's guilt trips, Eric's entitlement, all in writing, all documented. all piling up like the kind of evidence my grandparents had counted on me to collect, and with every message saved, I felt less like a victim and more like someone finally holding the pen to write her own narrative, knowing that the real redo wasn't theirs to stage, but mine to define. By the time the dust from the so-called redo had settled into a pile of unanswered texts, accusatory voicemails, and Eric's smug declarations that I was ruining the vibe, the family narrative had begun to mutate into something even more insidious. Because now the spreadsheet that had listed me as a contributor was quietly circulating among relatives who never should have seen it, and instead of being horrified that my name was attached to a 5-figure sum without my consent, some of them started whispering that I was being stingy, selfish, and overly dramatic, which proved to me that the real danger was not just in what my family expected from me privately, but in how easily they could manipulate the story publicly to paint me as the problem. It was in that atmosphere of mounting pressure that Brianna, my brother's fiancée, decided to reach out directly with a message so carefully worded it might as well have been run through a PR filter, telling me that it would mean the world if I could contribute something significant to help them secure their dream home before the rate lock expired, attaching photos of mood boards filled with glossy countertops, backyard patios, and the kind of staged happiness that photographs well but costs a fortune in real life. I stared at the message for a long time, not because I was tempted to give in, but because it revealed exactly how seamless the transition had been between my parents' expectations and Brianna's assumptions, as if the torch had been passed from one generation to the next, and I was supposed to carry the weight without complaint. Noah, reading over my shoulder, muttered something under his breath about how she had clearly mistaken me for an ATM with a graduation cap, and his dry humor broke the heaviness enough for me to laugh. But the truth was that underneath the sarcasm I felt a deep, simmering anger, not only at the audacity of their requests, but at the way they expected me to internalize their needs as my responsibility. That same day, Aunt Lila sent me a voice memo that I listened to 3 times in a row, because her tone carried both affection and warning. She reminded me of countless moments when my grandparents had tried to push back against the family's obsession with making Eric the centerpiece of every gathering. From birthdays where he blew out candles that weren't his to holidays where gifts were distributed unequally but explained away as tradition, and she confessed that my grandparents had privately expressed real concern that unless someone drew a line, the cycle would continue long after they were gone. They didn't want their estate to become another stage for favoritism, she said, her voice breaking slightly at the end, and those words settled into my chest like a challenge I had no choice but to meet. So instead of agreeing to a redo, instead of booking another restaurant table where I would stand in the shadow of my brother's champagne glass, I made a decision that was equal parts defiance and fulfillment. I would host a gathering of my own. But it would not be the glossy production my parents envisioned, and it would not be designed to impress Eric's circle of in-laws and realtors. I asked Aunt Lila if I could use her backyard, a simple space with mismatched chairs and a worn picnic table, and I invited only the people who had actually shown up for me during the years it took to finish my degree. Professors who had written recommendation letters, coworkers who had traded shifts so I could make it to class, 2 cousins who had driven across town for the real graduation ceremony. It was not a long guest list, but it was honest, and it was mine. That Saturday afternoon, under a sky that threatened rain but held steady, I stood in front of that small circle of people and announced something that had been forming in my mind since the moment I read my grandmother's letter. I told them that I was creating the Evelyn and Thomas Carter Book Grant in partnership with the local library, a fund designed to provide students with resources my grandparents had always believed were essential, and that the first disbursement from the estate would go directly into that account. The reaction was immediate and emotional, real applause, real hugs, and real tears, and for the first time in months, I felt celebrated without conditions, seen without being positioned as someone else's backdrop. Noah caught my eye during the announcement, and the pride on his face told me I was doing more than honoring my grandparents. I was rewriting the script that had been handed to me since childhood. Later that evening, I posted a simple photo of the library partnership announcement on social media, tagging only the library and Aunt Lila, with no mention of my parents, no reference to Eric, and no apology for the exclusion. Within hours, messages started to pour in, not from family members, but from acquaintances and colleagues who congratulated me for creating something meaningful, praising the thoughtfulness of the grant, and reminding me that impact is not measured by the size of a dinner crowd, but by the longevity of what you leave behind. Of course, my father eventually called, his voice laced with fury, accusing me of embarrassing them publicly by making a donation that looked like a stunt, and demanding to know why I hadn't coordinated with the family first, as if legacy was supposed to be negotiated in committee. I let him rant until he was breathless, then calmly told him that my grandparents' letter had been addressed to me, not to the Carter Family Board of Directors, and that I had no obligation to run my decisions through people who had skipped my most important milestone. Almost immediately after I hung up, an email from the attorney landed in my inbox, a clinical note asking if I anticipated continued family pressure as the probate date approached, and I realized that what had just happened was not an isolated flare-up, but the preview of a larger battle, one that would demand every ounce of resolve I had. Still, in that moment, I felt a strange kind of triumph, because I had taken the narrative they were trying to twist and replaced it with a version they could not manipulate, one that stood on its own, rooted in the values my grandparents had believed in. And no amount of spreadsheets, guilt trips, or angry phone calls could erase the fact that, for once, I was the one setting the stage. And while I knew the fight was far from over, I also knew that the cost of being seen, truly seen for who I was and what I stood for, was worth every ounce of conflict it provoked, because at last, the applause was mine, not borrowed, not conditional, and not a placeholder for someone else's celebration. In the weeks that followed the announcement of the scholarship fund, the tension in my family did not fade as I had hoped it might, but instead tightened like a rope pulled from both ends. Because rather than accepting my decision and acknowledging that the money was not theirs to script, my parents doubled down on their attempts to reclaim control, calling and emailing with elaborate justifications for why this was all a misunderstanding, why unity should come before stubbornness, and why, in their words, Eric's future is the family's future, which was nothing more than a repackaged version of the same favoritism I had lived under since childhood. They told me that if I wanted peace, I should compromise by helping with his house purchase, even just a portion, because it would prove to everyone that I wasn't trying to embarrass them. But the problem was that I was no longer afraid of embarrassing them. I was afraid of betraying myself and betraying the trust my grandparents had placed in me by giving me something they had specifically shielded from this exact kind of pressure. Eric, emboldened by the whispers of relatives who believed his version of events, sent me messages that shifted rapidly from guilt to threats to mockery, first suggesting that if I gave him even half of what they had budgeted for me on that spreadsheet, he would make sure the family saw me as generous, and then accusing me of being jealous that his engagement had outshone my graduation, and finally warning that people would remember who helped and who refused, as if the only legacy that mattered was whether he moved into a house with a large enough backyard for barbecues. I read every word, saved every screenshot, and each time I added one more piece of evidence to the growing pile that proved my grandparents had been right to place conditions on their gift. Because what they had seen long before I had the courage to name it was that manipulation only survives in shadows, and once exposed to light, it begins to rot. When the probate attorney reached out with the final paperwork, asking me to come in and review the estate structure before funds were released, I felt both relief and dread, because I knew this meeting would mark the transition from potential to permanence, from being the overlooked daughter to being the executor of my grandparents' intent. Noah came with me, as he always did when the weight of it threatened to overwhelm me, and together we sat in that office while the attorney confirmed that the estate was mine to manage, that the scholarship fund could be formalized exactly as I envisioned, and that any attempts at coercion or financial pressure were grounds to exclude the guilty parties from the smaller bequests they had assumed would arrive. I signed the documents with a steady hand, knowing that with every stroke of ink, the last flimsy excuses my family clung to were dissolving, replaced by something far stronger than their guilt trips: legal reality. After that meeting, I decided it was time to stop avoiding the inevitable confrontation, so I arranged to sit down with my parents and Eric, not in the cozy comfort of their home, but in a neutral space where every word could be measured, where the performance of family warmth could not blur the sharp edges of truth. I arrived with a neat folder of documents, the original letter from my grandparents, the coercion clause highlighted, the screenshots of my mother's texts, the infamous wedding spreadsheet with my name attached to a contribution I had never agreed to, and my carefully organized album of receipts documenting every time I had quietly covered a bill or bridged a gap when they were in need. I placed the folder on the table, looked each of them in the eye, and told them calmly that I would no longer participate in a system where my worth was measured by how much I gave and how little I asked for in return. My mother tried to cry her way out of it, my father tried to lecture me back into submission, and Eric tried to turn the conversation into a shouting match about loyalty, but I refused to rise to any of it because the letter had given me more than money. It had given me authority, and I was finally using it. I told them that the estate would fund the scholarship in my grandparents' names, that I would use the remainder for my own life, and that no portion of it would ever be diverted into private loans or quiet handouts to support a house, a wedding, or a lifestyle that my grandparents had already predicted would drain me dry if I allowed it. I reminded them that if they truly wanted to celebrate me, they had one option: attend the library's award night, sit in the audience, clap for the students who would benefit from the grant, and keep their mouths shut. Because that was the only ceremony I was offering them, and whether they chose to show up or not was entirely on them. For a long moment, no one spoke, and then Eric, in a final attempt at leverage, announced that his wedding rehearsal dinner had been scheduled for the exact same night as the scholarship award. As if by forcing another conflict, he could drag me back into the familiar pattern of choosing between his spotlight and my own dignity. I looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding someone completely, and I said, "Then you won't see me that night," and the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than any argument I had ever made, because it made plain that his manipulations had lost their power. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something break free inside me, not just relief, but a sense that the cycle had finally been interrupted, that I was no longer the background character in a family drama built around Eric's ego, but the author of my own story, one that ended not with cruelty or revenge for revenge's sake, but with the quiet brilliance of boundaries held firm. My parents could rage, Eric could sulk, relatives could whisper, but the truth was written into the structure of the estate, the existence of the scholarship, and the undeniable record of what had been said and done. And as I locked the folder away that evening, knowing the fight was not over, but the outcome was already decided, I realized that what my grandparents had left me was not just an inheritance of money, but an inheritance of clarity. A final gift that said, in no uncertain terms, that I was worth protecting, even if it meant protecting me from the people who should have done it first. That was my victory, and while it would never be the kind of applause Eric craved, it was the kind of triumph that lasts, the kind that whispers into your bones. She won. She turned the tables, and it was brilliant.